Fall of 1944 arrived not with color and crisp air, but with a kind of stillness that felt like the world was holding its breath, as if the earth itself had gone silent, unsure of how much more loss it could bear. The war, by then, had stretched its fingers across oceans and borders, consuming not just towns and battalions, but entire families, histories, and the names of boys who never thought they'd become soldiers. I was one of them, just a man from a quiet town with a front porch and a woman who loved him. And though the headlines spoke of global battles, artillery, and liberation, my war lived in the soft tremble of her voice that morning when she asked if I'd come back, even if she didn't say the words aloud. Her eyes, those clear, unflinching eyes of hers, spoke enough, and I answered not with declarations or poetry, but with a simple, breathless promise. When the leaves fall again, I'll come back. We were standing at the edge of the season, where summer had already slipped away, and the trees were just beginning to shed the first of their amber coats. I could smell the damp earth, hear the groan of distant train tracks, and feel her fingertips, cold and unwilling, slip out of mine as the wind picked up around us. Before I walked away, I took a piece of wood, a flat board I'd carried in my rucksack, and with the same pocket knife my father gave me before his own war, I carved my name into the grain. Then I nailed it to the old oak tree by her porch, its bark coarse under my fingers, the iron nail biting in like an anchor. "If I don't come back," I whispered, though I don't know if she heard me, "this will tell you where I still belong." We didn't say goodbye like lovers do in the movies. No tearful last kiss, no whispered confessions at the station, because what we had wasn't fragile or new. It was old and rooted and scared of being spoken too loudly, as though naming it would tempt the war to take that too. The train came. The smoke stung my eyes. Her figure grew smaller in the distance, standing on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, scarf fluttering like a flag caught between surrender and hope. And I left. That was the last time I saw her, until the very end, until the last day of fall, when the trees were bare and the wind carried my footsteps back to that porch, and she heard them, and she knew. If this story touched something in you, the way it did in me while writing it, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be remembered, just like the people who lived them. And now, hold on tight, because what comes next will stay with you. I left on a cold September morning in 1944, the sun just beginning to climb above the rust-red barns and cornfields of southern Indiana, where the air smelled like wet earth and firewood, and the train tracks ran straight through the fields like a promise you couldn't break. Mary stood on the porch, with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, wearing that red scarf her mother had knitted back in '29 during the harsh winter, and I could see in her eyes, even though she didn't say it, that she wasn't ready to let me go. Not again, not after the telegrams that had already reached 2 families on our road. Before I left, I walked to the old oak tree that stood watch at the edge of her family's yard, the same one we'd carved our initials into as kids, when summers felt endless and the war was something far away in books or newspapers. And I pulled a flat wooden board from the barn, carved my name into it with the same knife my father had carried through France in the Great War, and nailed it to the tay. With the kind of force that makes a promise stick. Not just to wood, but to time, to hope, to someone's heart. "If I don't make it back," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if she heard me over the whistle of the train in the distance, "this will remind you where I belong." We didn't kiss goodbye. We didn't say "I love you." We didn't dare. Because saying those words in wartime feels too much like tempting fate, like giving the world one more thing to take. The train rolled east, rattling over rails that had carried boys just like me, farmers' sons, factory workers, high school seniors turned riflemen, toward a front line most of us couldn't imagine. I was headed for Europe with the 2nd Armored Division, just weeks before they would join the push through Aachen and into the Hürtgen forest, places I couldn't yet pronounce, but would come to know by the sounds of mortar fire, frostbite, and the long silence that followed explosions. In the chaos of war, sleeping in foxholes, marching through Belgian mud, watching men vanish in a flash of shellfire near Bastogne, I held on to one thing more than my rifle or rations: the memory of her on that porch, the wind in her hair, the oak tree, the board with my name, the sound of autumn leaves under boots, as if each step toward battle was a step away from everything I loved. At night, when we had a moment to rest, I would close my eyes and pretend the canvas tent was the sky above our hometown, that the chill in the air wasn't fear, but October setting in, and I could almost hear the crunch of leaves underfoot as I walked up her porch steps, a sound so specific, so sacred to me, that it became a heartbeat I carried through the Ardennes. Each passing week made the world darker, colder, not just because of the season, but because of what we saw. Friends we laughed with in boot camp now wrapped in tarps, villages reduced to cinders, cathedrals crumbling under artillery. And yet, in that devastation, I clung to one image: her waiting, her standing by the window, her still believing in the sound of my footsteps returning home. When frost coated the trees and the war dragged us deeper into Germany, I counted days, not by calendars, but by how many leaves I imagined had already fallen back home. I wondered how cold the porch would be now, whether her father had chopped the wood like always, whether the scarf still held her scent, or if it had long since been tucked away in a drawer, folded with hope and grief in equal measure. The hardest part wasn't the war itself. It was the space between us, the silence that grew louder with every mile. Mail was sporadic, censored, or gone entirely. I wrote when I could, but none of the words felt big enough. None of them could say, "I'm still me." None of them could promise I'd be the same man who left, but I remembered what I said. When the leaves fall again, I'll come back. And somehow, that promise, nailed into an oak tree back in Indiana, mattered more than any orders or coordinates or medals. It was the one thing that made me feel human, the one thing that made me believe in something beyond the cold and the dying. And as the autumn deepened in Europe, as leaves fell across unfamiliar soil, I knew hers were falling too. I imagined them drifting across the porch, catching in the corners, gathering beneath the steps. I imagined the sound they'd make under my boots. And I prayed with everything I had left that when I finally walked up those steps again, she'd be there to hear them. I tried writing to her as often as I could. Every few nights, with the moonlight flickering through tent canvas, or in a damp dugout after a march through mud, I would pull out scraps of paper, sometimes from ration boxes, sometimes torn from sketchbooks, and with a pencil that nearly broke under my trembling hand, I'd write, "It snowed today. I thought of your red scarf, how the flakes would melt on your hair, and I would catch the scent of smoke from your kitchen chimney." Words like that, heavy with memory, each line an ache, each sentence a reaching out across continents and armies and fear. But none of those letters ever reached her. The mail routes were chaotic and broken. Trucks ambushed in the Ardennes, field post stations destroyed in bombing raids west of Aachen, censorship officers tearing open envelopes for fear they contained coded messages, letters lost in the flood of dispatches sent back toward England or the US. Many simply never making it past the turmoil of war, which swallowed the hopes of many in its hungry chaos. So I kept those letters hidden in my pack, folded paper under my tunic, beneath the lining of my boots, pressed between pages of my dough-geared Bible, because even though they were unsigned to the world, they were signed to my heart. I took a life for the first time. I don't know if I'm still worthy of you. I wrote that on a cold night by candlelight in Normandy, shaking from more than just cold, because killing changes a man, even when the cause is just, even when you're told it's for freedom. I wrote about the nights without sleep, the stars over Bastogne, and the smell of wet pine after the rain, hoping she'd feel dry beneath her roof, hoping her hearth was warm, hoping she was safe. I wrote, "If I return, I won't be the same man, but I'll be yours," because I believed that love meant more than memory. Love meant showing up, even if broken, even if changed. But fear grew louder with each passing dawn. What if she had moved on? What if she believed the letters were lies, or that I had been lost in action? What if her world at home, counting on Sunday church, baking bread, tending garden, had no place for the sound of my footsteps anymore, had no room for promises made under a war-scarred sky? Sometimes I imagined her reading what I'd written if only one letter had survived, sitting by the window with candlelight in the early evening, the red scarf around her neck, perhaps folding laundry, perhaps pausing at the hearth and reading words that said more than I dared to say. I pictured tears or a smile or both. I pictured her touching that wooden board on the oak tree, fingers tracing the name I carved, imagining that even if she didn't have the letters, she had that as proof. The war marched through winter and spring, and letters rotted, papers curled, ink smudged, stolen by rain, burned in shellfire, seized by military police who feared sentiments might weaken resolve, who thought longing and memories were luxuries no army could afford. I heard stories from other soldiers, letters opened by censor, parts cut out, pages torn, entire envelopes destroyed because they spoke of home too much, of fear too much, of hope too much. In Italy, in the snow-clad Alps, or in the hedgerows of Normandy, I carried the weight of unspoken words. I remember a night near the Salerno landing when mortar fire trembled the ground beneath me, and I whispered into the dark, "Mary, I tried to write to you today, but the rain erased my words." And I believed those erased lines had lives of their own, silent yet alive in the corners of my mind. On rest days, I listened to other soldiers reading their letters, fragments of home. "Tell my little sister I'll bring her that doll. Tell Mama I planted the peas she wanted this year." Their words patched holes in my armor of grief. I longed to hear one addressed to me, one that had my name on the corner in Mary's looping script. But always I found only silence in return. I held on to her old notes too, letters she had sent before the war began, postcards with pressed flowers, the edges yellowed, the print of her heart in every line, little drawings of our porch, of that oak tree, of summer evenings, when the fireflies danced among the hydrangeas, the promise of something simple and true. In those notes, I found solace. When letters I wrote seemed lost, I read hers again and felt time collapse, felt summer's warmth leak into the cold trenches, felt her voice whisper against my cheek, and fear, always fear, that when I finally returned, those letters she once wrote, those memories she once held, would have faded or broken like brittle leaves, or been forgotten in the dust of war, the breaking of time. What if the porch had aged too much, wood rotted, paint peeled, the oak tree stricken by disease or storm, the board I nailed so purposefully gone, lost, or unrecognizable? Still, I wrote. The war demanded bravery, but the act of writing was brave in its own way. To believe in a return, to believe that the promise mattered, to believe that love built from absence could survive shells and stars and the cold nights of foreign soil. Because in the end, letters never sent are more than regrets. They are witness to what a man carried in his bones. And each word I folded, each sentence I stashed in shadows and rain, each plea to be remembered became a vow to come home, not just in body, but in the echo of footsteps Mary would hear, in the sound of leaves beneath boots, in the quiet of a porch, sharing both grief and relief. The war ended for me just before winter of 1945, after the Battle of the Bulge thawed into the push toward the Rhine, after the men of the 101st Airborne had held Bastogne against freezing cold and Bavarian fog, after my own division had crossed the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, watching it groan under tanks and artillery, so wounded and nearly broken that every breath felt like a gift I barely deserved. Wounded in body and haunted in soul, I was discharged and told to find my way home, told to carry my papers, my uniform, my memories, and the name I had carved into that wooden board by Mary's old oak, hoping that each step toward the train station, each ticket punched, each whistle and squeal of railcar would bring me closer to the porch I had left in 1944. I boarded trains in ruined European cities, windows blown out, station clocks shattered, platforms piled high with debris and refugees, young mothers clutching children in tattered coats, old men staring at nothing, moving west, then south, then north, trying to follow routes that weren't always safe, routes that zigged through liberated towns like Aachen and Metz, then through France, through Paris, still scarred by occupation but lit with relief, through Normandy, through the Channel ports, then on a troop ship across the Atlantic, salt in my lungs, decks crowded with strangers whose eyes held the same mix of hope and haunted loss, until I stepped off in New York Harbor and felt the land under my feet again, foreign and familiar all at once. I traveled through small towns in Pennsylvania and Ohio, where billboards still announced "Welcome Home" in peeling paint, where farmers' fields stretched golden under autumn sun, where churches tolled bells that sounded like the echo of something I crept awake to in my dreams. New America, rebuilt America, a land that had sent men to fight, that had lost sons and cried for them, and now gathered. Families with tears and whistles at stations, the people I passed wearing coats and gloves, hats pulled low, waiting for someone, maybe me, to get off the train with a duffel bag, with scars, with stories no postcard could carry. I told no one ahead of time where I was going. I feared that people I knew might already have given up on me, that Mary might have moved on, that the world I left behind had erased me, that the oak tree might be gone, or the house boarded up, or worse, that even if I returned, she would look at me and see not the man who promised, but a stranger whose eyes had grown cold, whose hands trembled, whose uniform bore the smell of war and loss more than the smell of home. It was the very last day of autumn, when I finally made my way up the hill toward her house. The map in my hands, creased from travel, the ticket from the train from Chicago still tucked in my pocket, my coat threadbare but clean, my boots polished enough, but with scuffs no polish could hide, and I looked at trees whose leaves were hardly there, branches dark against overcast sky, wind carrying Dr. Ants and memory, carrying leaves across the ground, scattering them like fragile promises, and I wondered if she would still be there, if the light in her window would recognize me as the one who walked away. Fear nearly stopped me at the gate. Fear that I would knock and she would not answer, that I would see the porch swing empty, the red scarf gone, the oak tree chestnut and rough, but with no board nailed to it. But I forced myself to move, step by step, across cracked walkway, past bushes untrimmed, paint on the siding peeling, shutter hanging off one hinge, the house quiet, soundless except for the wind rattling loose panes, dry oak leaves skittering under my boots, sound that felt like everything I feared, that I had come back too late. When I reached the porch, I paused, hand raised to knock, but something inside me cried to stop, to turn and run back to steam heat rooms and bright city lights, safe in anonymity. But I remembered her face. I remembered the promise. I remembered the name carved in wood, and so I knocked softly, the boards beneath me creaking. Inside I heard a step, a house settling perhaps, or a footfall. Then another, shadows shifting behind curtains. Then the door opened. She stood there. I saw the light fall across her cheek, saw her eyes I had dreamt of for months, see me, and in that seeing I panicked. Would she see the man I had become? Would she only see the wounds and the uniform? Would she recognize that name carved in wood, or mistake it for some old memory best left alone? She did not step back. She did not close the door. Instead, she said words I had said in my head so often I thought they were fantasy. "You came back." My voice shook too much to answer at first. Tears blurred what I thought were familiar lines. Lines of her mouth, the slope of her shoulders, the red scarf draped over them, frayed, worn, but still her. Her hands reaching for mine, holding me like someone retrieving a piece of themselves that they feared they'd lost forever. She said, "I waited every afternoon for your footsteps on the porch. Even when leaves stopped falling, I leaned into the window each time the wind stirred, hoping for something, someone walking toward home." She pulled the wooden board from her coat pocket. I didn't know she had kept it safe, wrapped in cloth, and held it up against the oak tree, nails old, wood cracked, name worn at the edges but still visible, still alive. In her eyes, I saw forgiveness and relief and something tender and powerful. The kind of love that does not ask that all be restored, but simply that someone return, that someone, not perfect, perhaps broken, be there. And in that moment, I realized that recognition is not about seeing the same man you left. It's about seeing a heart that kept its promise. The door creaked open slowly, a sound like wood yielding after years of waiting, and there she stood in the dim hallway light, Mary, thinner than I remembered, hair pinned back in the modest way she used to do when she thought no one was watching, wearing a faded dress still bearing the scent of home, the same scent of lavender soap and firewood smoke, and though time had drawn faint lines around. And her eyes and touched her hands with wear. Those eyes, those same eyes, were bright with an impossible hope, as though she had held on to the promise I had carved into that board on the oak tree, as though every night she had heard imagined steps, and every imagined step had kept her heart alive. "You promised you'd return in the fall," she said, voice low and steady, but rippling with something I had not expected. Relief, pain, joy, and disbelief all at once. A mixture of everything that had filled the quiet months without me. Her words trembled just slightly, as though she had practiced them in the dark, in the hollow places where fear lived, but spoke them now seeing me, seeing the scars, the clothes, the man I had become. I tried to speak, but tears rose first. Tears that came not from shame, but from something deeper, from the ache of not knowing whether I'd be met with hope or regret, and from the courage it took to step up those porch boards again, unsure if they would creak in welcome or collapse under the weight of memory. She came forward and held me as though I was something fragile, not because I was weak, but because love sometimes sees everything you hide. The wounds beneath the uniform, the letters never delivered, the nights when the world felt too loud or too empty, and still reaches out to touch you, to hold you, to believe in return. Every afternoon, in the echo of falling leaves, she said she listened for footsteps on the porch, the soft thunk of wood under boot, the rustle of dry foliage in wind, the sound of someone coming home. Even in winter's chill, even after snow covered the boards, she listened. Even in spring thaw, when birds returned and blossoms came, she listened still, as though love's ears are never deaf. Then she pulled from my coat pocket those letters, brittle at the edges, faded, some lines smudged by rain or night sweat, but each word still holding weight. "It snowed today. I thought of your red scarf. If I return, I won't be the same man, but I'll be yours. I took a life for the first time. I don't know if I'm still worthy." She read them aloud, her voice catching, showing me that even words I doubted would ever matter again had mattered, to her, to us. She held up the wooden board with my name, cracked by weather and time, the oak bark rough and faded, but still bearing the carved letters, still standing. And for a moment I saw her tears in the porch light, in the dusk, in the hush that followed her reading, in the soft weight of forgiveness she placed on my chest, in the way our shadows stretched together toward the house. Time hadn't given back what war stole. Laughter lost, innocence broken, seasons gone. But in that moment, time did something more important. It made us see each other again. Not as the past versions, but as ourselves. Changed, yes, but still whole enough to love, still enough to trust footsteps, still enough to believe that home isn't an address, but a promise kept. And so I stepped across the threshold into the house that had changed, floors warped, paint chipped, rooms echoing with silence, but into the arms of Mary, which felt like the place I had belonged all along. Outside, leaves drifted down in soft spirals. The oak tree rustled in a cold breeze that smelled of rain and hope, and I realized that recognition isn't in picture-perfect memories or unblemished youth. It's in hearing your name spoken across time, in seeing the person who waited, in letting them see you too, scars and doubts and all. Because on that last day of autumn, when the leaves had almost all fallen, she heard my footsteps on the porch. We stayed together until her final fall. Years later, when the leaves once again turned gold and drifted through the yard, landing on the same porch steps that had once held the weight of my return. And every afternoon, as the light dimmed earlier and the air carried the first scent of wood smoke and memory, I would play her songs on the old Victrola, the music low and trembling, the kind of sun Igs we had once danced to in quiet corners before the world fell apart, and outside, the oak tree would sway gently, dropping leaves like soft reminders of promises made and kept. That porch, once just wood and nails and peeling paint, became more than a structure. It became our altar, our stage, our sanctuary. It held stories in every creak, held seasons in every nail, and when the wind moved across it in the late afternoon, I sometimes swore I could still hear the echo of my boots from that first day I returned, as if time had remembered, as if love had carved its own path through the years, refusing to fade. The board I nailed to the oak, it's still there. Weather-worn, edges splintered, name faded to something more etched in soul than in sight, but it still holds. The tree itself, older now, leans a little to the east, branches thinned but rooted deep, like me. We both stand, not untouched by time, not unscarred, but we stand. The war didn't leave me when the guns went silent. The war lived on in dreams, in the way I folded letters without writing, in the silence I sometimes carried between sentences. But she, Mary, gave me something the war couldn't take. She gave me a reason not just to return, but to remain. Love didn't survive by miracle. It survived because it waited, because it trusted. Because even on the very last day of a season, someone believed that a promise whispered on a porch, carved into oak, could outlast the noise of the world. And it did. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever waited, ever hoped, ever believed in a return against all odds, share this story. Have you ever made a promise that lasted through silence, through time? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes, even at the end of the season, someone comes home.